It was Thanksgiving night when my parents slid a folder across the dinner table. At first I thought it was just family papers or maybe some old photos. But no, it was a stack of legal documents. My father cleared his throat and calmly told me that my sister would now be helping manage my clinic. Helping, he said, meant taking 25% of the profit from the business I had built from nothing into a $10 million clinic. And here's the kicker, she wouldn't have to invest a single dime. Not 1 cent. I sat there staring at my family, the people who should have been proud of me, realizing they had turned Thanksgiving dinner into an ambush. My mother's smile was thin, my sister's eyes gleamed, and my father thought he had me cornered. But I had come prepared. You see, while they believed I would quietly fold under pressure, I had already locked my clinic down with a legal clause no one in that room expected. What happened next froze my father in place, wiped the smirk off my sister's face, and forever changed the balance of power in my family. This is not just a story about betrayal, it's a story about survival, about standing up against the people you least expect to hurt you, and about winning when they're certain you'll lose. Stay with me because by the end of this story, you'll see exactly how I turned their ambush into their downfall, and why revenge can be the sweetest justice. Dr. Claire Whitman was 38 years old, a physical therapist who had built her practice from the ground up. The Monroe Wellness Center was her life's work, a clinic that grew from a rented room and late nights into a $10 million business with her name on the sign and her reputation tied to every patient who walked through the door. She was independent, sharp, and more determined than anyone gave her credit for, and that determination had cost her years of sleep comfort and companionship. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, Claire was no stranger to sacrifice, but she was still unprepared for what awaited her at her parents' home that evening. The hook of the story begins in that moment when she stepped back into the Whitman house for a holiday dinner that should have been about gratitude, tradition, and family. Instead, she could feel from the first instant that something was wrong. The air carried a tension she could not name, and even the familiar creak of the wooden floor under her heels seemed to echo with unease. Claire had not been back home for several months, her clinic keeping her too busy to entertain family dinners, but Thanksgiving was different. It was the one night she always forced herself to come back, even if it meant swallowing the unease she felt in their presence. She walked in with a polite smile, carrying a bottle of wine and a sense of obligation more than joy. Her mother, Marjorie, greeted her at the door with the kind of smile that showed more teeth than warmth. "Claire, darling, it's so good to see you," she said, taking the wine from her hand almost too quickly as if rehearsed. Her father, Harold, was standing a few steps behind, his posture stiff, his handshake firm, almost pressing her fingers harder than necessary. Claire studied their faces in the brief seconds after the greeting and recognized the performance. Something was being staged, though she did not yet know what. She reminded herself to breathe, reminding herself she had handled investors' insurance audits and more brutal confrontations than a family dinner. But still, this was her family, and that was never simple. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted turkey, the sense of tradition that should have felt comforting. Instead, the room itself felt like a stage set. The china gleamed too perfectly on the table. The silverware was aligned like soldiers. Even the candles in the dining room burned in precise symmetry. Her sister Sophie was already seated glowing in a carefully chosen dress, her eyes darting between their parents as if waiting for a cue. Claire caught the spark of something familiar in her sister's expression, the same spark Sophie had as a child whenever she was hiding a prank or plotting trouble. Claire had learned long ago to recognize it as danger. They sat at the table, and for a moment it almost passed for normal. Marjorie ladled mashed potatoes with a practiced smile. Harold carved the turkey. Sophie made light chatter about a new friend and holiday shopping. But Claire noticed the folder before the first bite. It was tucked by Harold's plate, the corner peeking out from beneath his napkin. Manila thick and far too deliberate to be an accident. Her pulse quickened, though she lifted her fork with measured calm. She had seen too many ambushes in boardrooms not to recognize one here at her parents' table. The small talk carried on, but Claire only half listened, her eyes flicking toward that folder as Harold's hand hovered near it. Finally, after a few bites of turkey and forced laughter from Sophie, the air shifted. Harold set down his fork with a deliberate clink against china, cleared his throat and reached for the folder. He slid it across the polished wood toward Claire, the sound of cardboard against varnish sharper than any knife. "Claire," he said in his steady, businesslike voice, "your mother and I have been talking about the future of your clinic." The words caught in her throat, and she pressed her hands flat against her lap to keep them steady. Marjorie leaned forward, her tone sweet but calculated. "Family businesses need family management, dear. We've decided that your sister Sophie will help take on the responsibilities. She's got the right personality for it, and it will free you to focus on patients." Sophie's smile widened, rehearsed, triumphant. Harold nodded as if the matter had already been settled. "We think it's only fair she manage things moving forward. She'll receive 25% of the profits, a fair share for the role she'll take." For a long moment, Claire sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the folder now resting near her plate. She did not touch it. She did not speak. In her mind, memories flickered, the endless nights studying while her peers slept, the years of debt, the nights spent eating canned soup while she funneled every spare dollar into equipment and rent. All of it had been hers to carry, hers alone. And now, here on Thanksgiving night, the people who were supposed to love her had turned it into a negotiation, an ambush cloaked in fine china and roasted turkey. She felt the heat rise in her chest, but she kept her face cold, her eyes steady. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her satisfaction barely contained. "This is good news, Claire," she said as though delivering a gift. "It means we're really a family business now. You won't have to worry about the boring management anymore. And I know I can grow things in ways you can't imagine." Claire turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting Sophie's, and for the first time that evening, she let her expression harden. She did not speak, but the message in her eyes was unmistakable. This was not gratitude, and this was not acceptance. It was war. The silence that followed felt louder than the clink of forks or the low hum of the dining room lights. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair, though he kept his face stern. Marjorie reached for her glass, sipping as though to fill the void. Sophie shifted again, trying to mask the flicker of unease that crossed her face when Claire did not respond with words. Claire had learned long ago that silence, when deliberate, could be sharper than anger. And tonight, that silence was her only weapon. The evening carried on, conversation stilted, food untouched, but the direction of the night had already been decided. What should have been a dinner of gratitude had turned into a battleground, and Claire knew as she finally lowered her fork and pushed her plate aside that this would be only the beginning. She had walked into Thanksgiving expecting a family dinner. Instead, she found herself in the opening move of a war for her life's work. Claire sat at the Thanksgiving table in silence, her eyes fixed on her sister's triumphant smile. She did not pick up the folder her father had slid across the polished wood, nor did she acknowledge the words that hung in the air. Instead, her mind slipped backward unbidden into the years that had brought her here, the years that explained why she could not simply nod and accept what was being demanded. The memories did not come gently. They rushed back sharp and vivid, each one a reminder of the price she had already paid. She remembered nights in her cramped apartment during graduate school, the walls so thin she could hear her neighbor's television bleeding through until morning. Her meals were almost always the same ramen noodles, sometimes with an egg if she could spare the extra cost and a stale slice of bread. She ate quickly often while hunched over textbooks, knowing she would have to leave soon for her overnight shift. The cafeteria at the hospital was where she worked, wiping down trays, hauling trash, and serving food to staff who barely noticed her beyond a mumbled thank you. She was exhausted every single day, her body running on caffeine and willpower, but she told herself it was temporary. She told herself that the sacrifices would matter someday. Her mattress was a thin fold-out tucked against the wall of the one-bedroom apartment, but she often didn't use it. There were nights she stayed at the clinic where she trained, finishing paperwork long after the hallways emptied. She would lie down on a treatment table, the crinkle of the disposable sheet beneath her cheek, her jacket pulled tight against the chill. Sleep was shallow and never long enough, but it was a way to save the bus fare home. More than once, she startled awake to the sound of cleaning crews moving their carts down the hall, embarrassed but too determined to let shame slow her down. In those years, her sister Sophie lived in a dorm with bright posters on the walls and a steady flow of new clothes and gadgets. Claire had made sure of it. From every paycheck, she scraped what she could and sent it back home because their parents claimed they could not cover both daughters' education. Claire, the older sister, was told she was strong, self-sufficient, that she would manage. Sophie, the younger, was the one to protect the one to support. So Claire paid. Tuition checks, book money, and even deposits for Sophie's sorority events passed through her weary hands. Each time she sent the money, she told herself she was being a good sister, that this was what family meant. Her parents praised Sophie constantly. At family gatherings, Sophie's achievements were laid out like trophies: her charming personality, her ability to make friends quickly, her knack for being noticed. Claire's milestones were barely mentioned. When she graduated top of her class, the applause was polite but distracted her father, reminding her that grades did not mean much in the real world. When she showed them her plans for a future clinic, they nodded vaguely and asked Sophie about her weekend plans instead. The imbalance was not subtle. It was woven into every comment, every comparison, every silence that followed Claire's attempts to share her own successes. One memory lingered sharper than the rest. It was a winter evening during her second year of graduate school. Snow piled against the window of her tiny apartment, and her heat had gone out again. She sat wrapped in 2 coats typing a research paper on her aging laptop when her phone buzzed. It was Sophie, her voice bright and careless, asking for another transfer because she had joined a new campus club and needed to pay the fee. Claire looked at her bank account, saw the dwindling numbers, and sent the money anyway. That night, she skipped dinner, choosing to hold on until her next shift at the hospital, where she could at least eat leftovers from the staff kitchen. Her family never knew these details, not really. They saw the polished end results, the framed degree, the professional smile, the clinic that eventually bore her name. They never asked what it took to get there, and they never acknowledged that without Claire's sacrifices, Sophie's carefree college years would have looked very different. Instead, they praised Sophie's hard work, her bright future, as though charm and presence alone had carried her forward. Claire learned to stop expecting recognition. She learned to hold her head high even when no one was watching, because she could not afford to wait for approval that would never come. Now, sitting at the Thanksgiving table with the manila folder so casually pushed toward her plate, Claire felt the weight of those years settle like stone in her chest. The taste of dry noodles and the sound of cafeteria trays clattering seemed more real to her than the roast turkey steaming on the table. She thought of the countless nights she had worked herself to the edge of collapse while Sophie slept soundly in a dorm bed bought with Claire's sacrifices. She thought of every time she had been told she was too serious or too focused, while Sophie's smallest achievements were met with applause. Her father's voice echoed in her mind from years earlier, dismissive and certain: book smarts don't build a future, Claire. People skills do. Look at your sister. At the time, she had swallowed her frustration and gone back to her textbooks. Tonight, she let that memory harden her resolve. She had built her clinic out of sweat and exhaustion, out of sleepless nights and empty stomachs. She had built it while carrying not just her own future, but her sister's as well. And now, on this night meant for gratitude, they wanted to take it as though it had always belonged to them. Claire's expression remained calm, her fork resting untouched beside her plate, but inside her heart pounded with quiet fury. She said nothing, not yet. She knew there would be a time to speak, and when she did, she would not waste words. For now, she let the memories strengthen her spine, let the silence sharpen the divide. She had been overlooked her whole life, and this dinner was only a new version of an old story. But Claire Whitman had not come this far to be erased. Sophie leaned forward, her polished nails tapping lightly against the stem of her wine glass, the picture of confidence. Her smile was wide, calculated, the kind that never reached her eyes. She glanced at her parents, then back at Claire, and spoke in the careful, rehearsed tone of someone delivering a presentation. "Claire, I've been thinking about you." I know how hard you work, the long hours, the stress of managing both patients and the business side of things. It's too much for one person. You shouldn't have to carry it all on your shoulders. That's where I come in. She reached for the folder her father had placed on the table earlier, sliding it closer to herself, as though it belonged to her by right. Opening it, she revealed neat pages, colorful charts, and bullet points clearly designed to impress. I've put together a business plan. If I step in as your clinic manager, you'll finally have time to breathe, to focus on the patients instead of drowning in paperwork. And really, who better to represent the family clinic than family people will connect with me instantly. I'm a people person, Claire, not like you, always buried in files and treatment charts. You can stay in your comfort zone with the medical side while I make the clinic thrive. Her words flowed with practiced ease, a performance polished for weeks, maybe months. Every phrase carried the same underlying message. Claire was incapable of handling what she had already built, and Sophie was the solution. Claire sat perfectly still, her face a mask of polite attention, but her thoughts raced. This was no spontaneous suggestion. The charts, the phrasing, the way her parents nodded in time with Sophie's words, it was all too orchestrated. This was a staged intervention, an ambush planned long before she walked through the front door. Marjorie chimed in with the softness of velvet hiding steel. Claire, darling, your sister has always been so good with people. You know that. She lights up a room, she makes everyone feel welcome. And she's right, you've taken on too much alone. You should be grateful she's willing to help. After all, you owe her. You're the older sister. You've always had more opportunities. It's only fair to let Sophie share in what you've built. Family shares, that's what makes us strong. The words landed like a blow. Claire's gaze shifted briefly to her mother, noting the way Marjorie's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree dressed in maternal language. Her parents weren't asking her to accept Sophie's help. They were telling her she had no choice. Sophie nodded eagerly at their mother's support, her voice slipping into something smug. Exactly. It's not about taking anything from you, Claire. It's about balance. You've been hogging the responsibility and, honestly, the spotlight. It's time I step in so we can be equals. I'll only take 25%, it's fair, really, considering how much I'll be adding. Claire's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her eyes remained cold. She had learned long ago that silence could be more unsettling than shouting. Her refusal to argue immediately, to protest or defend herself, created a vacuum that none of them knew how to fill. She could feel her father watching her, searching for a crack in her composure. She could hear the faint tremor in Sophie's voice when she continued a little too quickly, as if trying to cover her own unease. Inside, Claire's mind was sharp with realization. The charts, the folder, her mother's carefully chosen words, it was all a plan, a scheme they had laid out with confidence that she would fold under the weight of family obligation. But Claire had not survived years of sacrifice, of being dismissed and overlooked, only to hand her life's work over now. She kept her silence, her eyes steady on Sophie, and in that silence was the quiet promise of resistance. They thought they had her cornered, but they were about to learn how wrong they were. Claire sat in silence long enough for Sophie to mistake it for hesitation. Her sister's smile widened, her mother's eyes gleamed with triumph, and her father leaned back as though the decision had already been sealed. But Claire's stillness was not surrender. It was calculation. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached down beside her chair and lifted her leather briefcase onto the table. The sound of the clasp snapping open cut through the room sharper than any raised voice. She drew out a folder of her own heavy with legal contracts and placed it squarely in front of her father's manila folder. She did not rush. She took her time opening the binder and flipping through until she found the page she wanted. Then she tapped her finger against the bold heading, her voice calm but edged with steel. Clause 7.4, she said, meeting her father's eyes directly. No family member may be employed in management or ownership capacity. Not now, not ever. It's in writing. Signed, binding. The air thickened in an instant. Sophie blinked, her confidence faltering. Marjorie's lips parted as though she had not expected pushback at all. Harold, however, did not falter. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set. He slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "You ungrateful girl," he thundered, his voice shaking the candles in their holders. "We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us." Quoting legal documents at your own family on Thanksgiving. Claire did not flinch. She kept her hand steady on the page, her gaze never wavering. "I didn't ask for your sacrifice," she said evenly. "I built this clinic on my own. Every decision, every dollar, every sleepless night. Mine." It was then that Harold's mouth twisted into a cold smile, the kind he wore when closing a business deal. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a tone meant to wound. "On your own. You really believe that? That clinic wouldn't even exist if not for me. Who do you think signed the papers at the bank? Who do you think put his name on the line when they wouldn't trust a young woman drowning in student loans? Without me as guarantor, your precious dream would have died before it even started." The words landed like a punch. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her composure threatening to crack. She searched his face for any sign of exaggeration, but Harold's expression was deadly serious. She remembered those early meetings with the bank, the rejections, the frustration of being told her projections were ambitious, but unrealistic. She had gone back again and again until finally, miraculously, the loan was approved. She had convinced herself it was her persistence that broke them down. Now, at this table, she realized there had been another signature in the background, one she had never known about. Her stomach churned. She had believed her independence was complete, her success hers alone. To hear now that her father had tied himself to her clinic in secret, that he had hidden his involvement until it could serve as leverage, was a betrayal she had never imagined. Sophie smirked, emboldened by the revelation. "So really, Claire, it isn't just yours. It's always been a family investment. Maybe you should stop pretending otherwise." Claire swallowed hard, forcing her features into neutrality, though her mind reeled. The ground beneath her shifted with the weight of this new truth, but even in shock she understood what was happening. This was not generosity. It was a trap laid years ago, a chain disguised as help. Her father had never believed in her enough to stand beside her openly, only enough to hold a hidden card he could throw down at the moment he wanted control. She closed her folder quietly, the snap of the cover like a final word. Her voice was low, steady, and colder than they had ever heard it. "You may have signed your name, but I paid every dollar. I built every wall, and I will not let you use a hidden favor to strip me of what I earned." Her father's face darkened. Her mother clutched her pearls, and Sophie's smile faltered. For the first time that night, Claire let them see the fury simmering beneath her calm. She had walked into their ambush, and now she knew they had been plotting far longer than she realized. But she also knew their hidden card was not the end of the game. It was only the beginning. Claire left the Thanksgiving dinner with her jaw set and her heart pounding, the echo of her father's words still burning in her ears. The revelation that Harold had secretly signed as guarantor on her first loan rattled her, but it did not weaken her resolve. She knew now that the ambush had been carefully orchestrated, the folder at the table only one piece of a larger scheme. Driving back through the cold night, the streets blurred with frost, she told herself she had endured worse. She had survived years of doubt and sacrifice. She could withstand this too. Yet she underestimated just how far her family was willing to go once their first plan failed. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A whispered rumor surfaced among colleagues in the medical community, too specific to be accidental. A former patient mentioned that someone had suggested Claire's staff felt mistreated, that long hours and impossible expectations were driving them away. Claire dismissed it at first, assuming it was petty gossip. But then a second story appeared, this one more insidious, accusing her of mismanaging funds. Within a week, the whispers had coalesced into something darker, sharper. Sophie had started a smear campaign, and the target was Claire's very reputation. Online forums lit up with anonymous comments, all repeating the same themes. I heard Dr. Whitman is cruel to her staff. A friend told me she cuts corners and cheats insurance. Don't trust her clinic, she's under investigation. The repetition was intentional, a chorus of lies meant to sound like truth. Claire's staff came to her one by one, shaken, asking if the accusations were real. She reassured them, but the strain was visible. She had built her clinic on trust, on the loyalty of her team, and now that trust was being eroded by voices she could not see. The media seized on the story next. A local paper ran a headline that made Claire's stomach twist: $10 million clinic under fire. Allegations of tax evasion and staff abuse. The article quoted unnamed sources and cited documents under review, though no evidence existed. The photograph chosen was of Claire standing outside her clinic, caught mid-step, her expression serious, almost severe. To a reader unfamiliar with her, it looked like guilt. Other outlets followed, repeating the same claims until the narrative solidified into public opinion. The lies had become fact by sheer repetition. Patients began to call their voices hesitant. Some asked if what they had read was true. Others simply canceled appointments without explanation. The waiting room, once filled with the low hum of conversation, grew quieter each day. Chairs sat empty, files piled up with cancellation notices. For the first time since opening her doors, Claire saw the lifeblood of her clinic, her patients, slipping away. Each cancellation was a small cut, and together they bled her confidence dry. The financial impact followed swiftly. An investor who had backed her most recent expansion project called her office, his tone apologetic but firm. He could not risk association with a practice tainted by scandal, he said. His funds were being withdrawn immediately. Another investor followed suit within days. The safety net she had fought so hard to weave was unraveling strand by strand, leaving her exposed. Equipment orders were delayed, bills piled higher, and Claire found herself staring at balance sheets that suddenly no longer added up. She worked harder, arriving earlier and staying later, determined to hold the clinic together by sheer will. But late at night, when the last patient had left and the lights dimmed, she felt the walls closing in. She had built her clinic on integrity, on the belief that her work would speak louder than her critics. Yet here she was, fighting shadows cast by her own family. She could imagine Sophie's satisfied smile, Marjorie's calm insistence that family shares Harold's cold certainty that she was nothing without him. Each false headline and each withdrawn investment felt like their voices amplified into the world. Still, she refused to break outwardly. When her staff looked to her for reassurance, she steadied her voice and promised them the storm would pass. But inside she felt the foundation shaking. For the first time, she wondered if the clinic might actually fall. The sacrifice of years, the sleepless nights, and endless labor could be undone not by her mistakes, but by the lies of the people who should have been proud of her. One evening, after the last staff member had left, Claire sat alone in her office, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She flipped through the day's newspaper, reading the poisonous words again and again. Whitman, under investigation. Sources say clinic in crisis. She knew where the words came from. Sophie had always been adept at charm, at convincing others to believe what she wanted them to believe. Now she had turned that skill into a weapon wielded with devastating precision. Claire closed the paper, pressing her palms flat against the desk to stop the trembling in her hands. She looked around the office, the certificates on the wall, the framed photos of patients who had recovered the carefully chosen furniture that had once filled her with pride. All of it seemed fragile now, as if one more headline could shatter it into pieces. She drew a slow breath, forcing herself to steady. The walls might be shaking, but she was not yet ready to let them fall. She had weathered storms before, and though this one was unlike any she had faced, she would find a way through it. She had to. Outside her window, the city lights flickered against the night sky, indifferent to her struggle. Claire sat back in her chair, her eyes heavy but unyielding. They wanted her to crumble, to hand over the clinic in defeat. But even as the smear campaign gathered momentum, she felt something stir within her, a fire lit not by pride, but by fury. They had underestimated her once. They would not do so again. The smear campaign had already weakened Claire's confidence, but what truly shook her was realizing how quickly trust could crumble when whispers became headlines. She had convinced herself that her small circle of colleagues remained untouched by the poison spreading through the community. After all, they had worked alongside her, seen her sacrifices firsthand, and shared the victories of building the clinic from scratch. But loyalty, she was about to learn, was not universal. It was late on a Tuesday when she first noticed the irregularities. A patient she had treated for months called with a strange question about a promotional discount she had never authorized. At first, she thought it was a clerical error, but then more calls came in. Patients referenced emails supposedly from the clinic offering free sessions or deep reductions messages Claire knew had never been sent. When she checked the records, the emails were traced back to an account tied to Evelyn Ross, a senior therapist she had trusted like family. Claire's chest tightened as she dug deeper. She remembered every late night Evelyn had stayed to finish paperwork, every time she had brought coffee during an exhausting shift. Evelyn had been her sounding board, the colleague she leaned on when decisions felt too heavy. The thought that Evelyn might be involved in something against her seemed unthinkable. Yet the evidence was there. Files had been accessed outside of work hours, patient data pulled without authorization, and those files had one trail leading back to Evelyn. The confirmation came when Laura Chen, ever vigilant, confronted Claire with a printout. It was a series of transfers, patient lists, billing information, and internal schedules emailed to an address tied not to any insurance partner, but to Sophie herself. Claire stared at this page in disbelief, her pulse hammering in her ears. It was not just betrayal. It was the kind of breach that could destroy everything she had built. If Sophie possessed that data, she could target patients, directly undercut services, and dismantle the clinic from the inside. Claire wanted to storm into Evelyn's office and demand answers, but exhaustion and shock held her back. Instead, she sat quietly at her desk, waiting for Evelyn to arrive the next morning, rehearsing words she never thought she would have to say to someone she considered a friend. When Evelyn did arrive, carrying her usual travel mug of coffee, Claire confronted her directly. The denial was immediate, her voice sharp and defensive. But Claire slid the printout across the desk, her eyes unblinking. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn finally dropped her gaze, her shoulders slumping. She admitted in halting words that Sophie had promised her a senior position in the new Whitman wellness chain, a position with higher pay and prestige. All Evelyn had to do was share a few files. She insisted she never meant harm, that it was just business. To Claire, it felt like a knife twisted in her back. The consequences arrived faster than the betrayal itself. Word reached the corporate partners almost immediately. The healthcare group that had managed administrative support for the clinic contacted Claire with icy formality. They cited serious concerns regarding data security and professional ethics and announced the immediate suspension of their contract. They could not risk their name being tied to a practice under scrutiny. In a single call, Claire lost the stability she had fought for over years. Days later, auditors appeared at her door. The clinic was to be reviewed, they said, due to allegations of mismanagement and data mishandling. Claire watched as strangers in suits combed through her files, questioning her staff, scrutinizing every signature and every code. Patients in the waiting room glanced nervously at the men carrying briefcases, whispers spreading before Claire could contain them. Appointments were canceled on the spot. The phones rang less often. Each hour that passed under audit felt like a year. By the end of the week, the clinic was nearly paralyzed. Staff whispered in hallways, unsure if they would still have jobs. Patients avoided eye contact, fearing association with scandal. Evelyn had resigned quietly, her office emptied overnight, leaving only a hollow space and unanswered questions. Claire stood in that empty office one evening, her hand on the doorframe, fighting the ache in her chest. She had lost more than data. She had lost trust. She had lost the certainty that those closest to her were truly on her side. The clinic's hum of daily life had been replaced by silence and suspicion. Each patient file she opened carried the weight of betrayal. Each bill she signed felt like a test of survival. Claire knew her enemies outside the clinic, her parents and Sophie, were celebrating. But what cut deepest was knowing that the battle had been brought inside, that someone she once leaned on had become the weapon used against her. Standing alone in the dim hallway, she pressed her hand against the cool wall, steadying herself. She understood now that the fight was not only about protecting her business from external attacks. It was about defending it from the inside, from those who wore friendly faces while quietly passing ammunition to her enemies. Her clinic had been weakened, her partnership stripped away, her reputation scarred. For the first time since opening her doors, Claire wondered if she could keep them open at all. Yet beneath the despair, another thought began to form, sharp and steady. They wanted her broken, but they had not seen the strength she kept in reserve. If they thought this betrayal would end her, they had underestimated her yet again. Claire had grown used to silence in the clinic. After the audits began and Evelyn vanished without a trace, the hallways no longer buzzed with the easy rhythm of a team working together. Conversations dropped to whispers. Glances were exchanged with unease, and even the patients who still came in carried an air of hesitation. Yet amid that cloud of doubt, there were those who refused to let the foundation crumble. Laura Chen was the first to step forward. Laura had been Claire's clinic manager from the early days, back when the office consisted of little more than 2 treatment rooms and borrowed furniture. She had stayed through the lean years, through the nights when the payroll barely cleared and the equipment broke down mid-session. She was steady, unshakable, the kind of presence that gave patients comfort and staff confidence. One late evening, as Claire sat slumped at her desk, staring at figures that no longer made sense, Laura walked in holding a set of keys. She placed them gently on the desk and said, "I'm not leaving. I don't care what the papers say or what Sophie whispers in every corner of this town. This is still your clinic, and I'll keep it standing beside you." Claire looked up, her throat tight, but before she could respond, Laura continued. "I sold my car yesterday. It was old, and I can manage with the bus. The money will cover payroll for the front desk staff for another month." They were scared, Claire, but when I told them I'd stay, they said they would too. "We're not here for your family's games. We're here because of you." The words stunned her. Claire had spent so long believing she carried the burden alone, every sacrifice hers to make, every battle hers to fight. To see someone else willingly shoulder a piece of that weight brought a sharp ache to her chest. She tried to protest, to insist Laura shouldn't sacrifice personal security for the clinic, but Laura silenced her with a firm shake of her head. "You taught us that healing isn't just a job, it's a commitment. Well, this is ours. We're committed to you." The next morning, Claire walked into the staff meeting expecting grim faces and resignation. Instead, she found a small group gathered, their expressions serious but resolute. A therapist named Mark spoke first. "We know money is tight. Some of us can go without pay for a few weeks. Patients still need us, and we'd rather keep working than abandon them." Another nurse, Anna, chimed in. "You've always put your patients before profit. Let us put you before a paycheck for once." Claire's hands trembled as she listened, a mixture of relief and disbelief. These were not empty words. These were people offering pieces of their lives, their livelihoods, because they believed in her. In a world where her own blood had turned against her, here stood a family of another kind. She felt the tears well in her eyes, but forced her voice steady as she spoke. "I can't promise it will be easy. I can't even promise it will work. But if you stay with me, I swear I'll fight for every one of you." Laura met her gaze across the table and nodded. "Then we stay." It was not a grand victory. The phones still rang less often, the newspapers still ran their cruel stories, and the investors remained silent. But for the first time in weeks, Claire felt something she had thought she had lost: hope. The loyalty of those who stayed did more than keep the doors open. It lit a fire inside her again. She was reminded that her clinic was more than contracts and profit margins. It was the trust built with people who saw her worth even when her own family did not. That evening, as she locked the clinic doors, Claire paused and looked back at the dimly lit waiting room. The chairs were empty, the air still heavy with uncertainty, but her chest no longer felt hollow. Where betrayal had hollowed her out, Loyalty now began to fill the space. She whispered to herself almost like a vow. If they're willing to fight for me, I'll fight twice as hard for them. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the Thanksgiving ambush, Claire walked away from the clinic with her shoulders squared and her spirit steadied. The storm still raged outside, yet inside she no longer felt alone. The clinic was still fragile, but Claire felt a renewed strength after her staff had chosen to stay by her side. Their loyalty gave her enough resolve to face the empty waiting rooms and the rumors that still circulated outside the clinic walls. Yet she knew loyalty alone would not rebuild what had been torn down. There were moments late at night when the silence of her office pressed too heavily, when the numbers on her balance sheets looked more like tombstones than pathways forward. In those moments, she thought of one person who had guided her through darker times before, and she found herself picking up the phone. The following week, she drove across town to a quiet neighborhood clinic that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. It was there that Dr. Helen Graves, her former mentor, still worked part-time even after retirement. Helen had been one of Claire's professors in physical therapy school, a woman with a calm presence and a sharp mind, the kind of teacher who believed in students no one else noticed. Claire had not seen her in years, but stepping into the modest waiting room felt like stepping into a place of safety. Helen greeted her warmly, her eyes crinkling with recognition, as if no time had passed. They sat in her office, a space lined with books and framed photos of students and colleagues. Claire had intended to keep the conversation professional, but as soon as she began describing the chaos of the past weeks, her voice wavered. She told Helen about the smear campaign, the betrayal by Evelyn, the audits, and finally the fragile loyalty of the few who stayed. Helen listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady and unjudging. When Claire's words faltered into silence, Helen leaned forward and spoke with the quiet authority that had once guided an entire classroom. Claire, I know it feels like the ground has been pulled out from under you, but I want you to remember something I told you when you were still a student. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes blood is the very thing that holds you back. What matters is who shows up when everything falls apart. That's your true family. The words struck Claire deeply. She thought of Laura selling her car to cover payroll, of Mark and Anna volunteering to work without pay, of the staff who had chosen belief over fear. She realized those acts were more meaningful than any empty praise she had ever received from her parents or sister. Helen's voice grew firmer as she continued. Blood ties can be chains, Claire. You have been carrying guilt for years, paying debts that were never yours to pay, convincing yourself that sacrifice would earn you love. But love that has to be bought isn't love at all. Stop looking for validation in places that will never give it. Build with those who already stand beside you. Claire felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning. No one had ever said it to her so plainly, not even she herself. All her life she had tried to prove something to Harold and Marjorie, to Sophie, to anyone who dismissed her efforts. Even now, every headline, every rumor cut so deeply because it echoed the words she had heard from her family for years, that she was never enough on her own. Helen's reminder was like a key turning in a lock. It released her from a prison she had not even realized she had built around herself. They spoke for hours, Helen sharing stories of her own career, of times when colleagues betrayed her, of moments when she too had felt invisible. She described the strength it took to rebuild, not because the world suddenly believed in her, but because she finally believed in herself. Claire listened intently, absorbing every word as if it were medicine. Before leaving, Helen reached across the desk and took Claire's hand, her grip firm despite her age. You have already proven your strength, Claire. Now you must decide what you will build from the ashes. Stop letting their voices echo in your mind. Choose the ones who deserve your loyalty and let the rest go. Driving back that evening, Claire replayed Helen's words again and again. The city lights blurred past, but her mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. She thought of the empty chairs in her waiting room, not as reminders of failure, but as spaces waiting to be filled again. She thought of the loyal faces of her staff, of the patients who still believed of the possibility that the clinic could rise again, not because of her family name, but in spite of it. For the first time since the ambush at Thanksgiving, Claire did not feel like she was simply holding on. She felt like she was ready to begin again. By the time she reached her apartment, she had made her decision. The clinic would not be left to collapse under the weight of betrayal and lies. She would rebuild it not by seeking approval from those who undermined her, but by anchoring herself to those who had already proven their loyalty. Helen's words had stripped away the last remnants of doubt, leaving only determination. As she set her bag down and turned off the lights, Claire whispered aloud into the quiet of her home, "From the ground up if I have to. But this time, it will be mine alone." Claire returned home from her meeting with Dr. Helen Graves carrying a clarity she had not felt in months. Helen's words still rang in her mind, reminding her that loyalty was not bound by blood, but by choice. That clarity fueled her decision the very next morning. Instead of staring at the echoing emptiness of her once thriving clinic, she began searching for something smaller, humbler, something that would let her start again without the weight of looming debt and constant scrutiny. Within a week, she founded a single-room office tucked between a laundromat and a small bakery on the edge of town. The rent was modest, the walls thin, and the lighting harsh, but to Claire, it was a seed of possibility. Signing the lease felt like reclaiming her breath. There was no staff this time, no receptionist to greet patients, no assistants to set up the equipment. Claire knew it would all fall to her. On her first morning, she unlocked the door and stepped into the bare room with nothing but a second-hand treatment table, a filing cabinet she had salvaged, and a laptop balanced on an old wooden desk. She rolled up her sleeves, wiped down the surfaces herself, and set out a pot of flowers in the window to soften the sterile edges. The space was nothing compared to the state-of-the-art facility she had lost, but it was hers, and it was honest. The first patients who found their way to her new office came hesitantly. Most had followed her from the old clinic, determined to stand by the therapist who had restored their mobility or relieved their pain when no one else could. Others arrived out of curiosity, drawn by word of mouth and quiet trust, rather than advertisements or glossy campaigns. Some days, only 1 or 2 patients appeared, and other days, no one came at all. Claire did not let it deter her. She used the gaps between appointments to refine her treatment plans, organize her limited resources, and remind herself that building slowly was better than not building at all. Without staff, she managed every detail herself. She scheduled appointments, answered calls, cleaned the equipment, and processed payments. At first, the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but there was also an unexpected satisfaction in it. She controlled every piece of the work, and nothing was filtered through layers of management or distorted by hidden agendas. When a patient walked through the door, Claire was the one to greet them with a smile, guide them to the table, and treat them with the same care she had given when she had a dozen staff by her side. It was in those quiet sessions that she began to notice something shift. Patients who had read headlines filled with scandal sat across from her and felt the steadiness in her voice, the competence in her hands. They left not only with eased muscles or improved movement, but with a renewed trust in her. They told their friends, their neighbors, and slowly the empty days began to fill with names written into her appointment book. One patient, an elderly woman who had followed Claire from her old practice, clasped her hand after a session and said softly, "They can write what they want in the papers, but this is the truth. What you do here is real." That truth became Claire's anchor. Every day she worked in that small room, she reminded herself that she was not defined by the glitter of a multi-million-dollar clinic or the approval of investors. She was defined by her ability to heal, to listen, and to serve those who trusted her. Even on days when exhaustion pulled at her shoulders, she found a sense of peace in the rhythm of it. Sweep the floor, answer the phone, treat the patient, record the notes. It was simple, repetitive, and grounding. Her faith in herself, nearly shattered by betrayal and loss, began to mend through these small victories. Each time a patient returned, each time someone walked out smiling and grateful, Claire felt a piece of her own strength restored. The clinic may have been a single room with peeling paint, but within its walls, she rediscovered the purpose that had driven her from the start. She remembered why she had chosen this path, not for applause, not for recognition, but because healing mattered. Late one evening after closing, Claire sat on the treatment table with the day's earnings, just a handful of payments and envelopes spread out before her. It was not much, but it was honest work built from her own hands and her own persistence. She thought of her father's sneer, her sister's smirk, her mother's manipulative words. None of them were here. None of them had anything to do with the patients who returned because they believed in her. The realization settled into her bones like warmth after a long winter. She no longer needed their approval to know her worth. As she locked the office and stepped into the cool night air, the scent of bread from the bakery next door drifted into the street. She paused, drawing in a deep breath. It wasn't the glamorous life she had once imagined, but it was life, it was progress, and it was hers. In that moment, Claire knew she had chosen the right path. Starting small did not mean starting weak. It meant starting honest. And from honesty, she could build again. For a time, Claire's one-room clinic began to feel like a sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild without the noise of her family's ambitions shadowing her every step. She swept the floors, welcomed each patient by name, and poured every ounce of her energy into those few who still trusted her. Slowly, the empty hours on her appointment calendar began to fill. Word of mouth spread, and though the progress was modest, it was steady. Claire felt that perhaps the worst storms had passed. But storms, she was learning, rarely vanish. They gather strength and return in new forms. It was on a gray morning with rain tapping against her small office window that she first heard the news. A patient walked in with a glossy magazine folded under her arm. She laid it on Claire's desk with a half-apologetic smile. "Did you see this? Your sister is everywhere?" Claire unfolded the pages and was confronted with a full-color spread. Sophie, draped in an elegant suit, standing in front of a sparkling new facility, beneath a shining gold sign that read, "Whitman Wellness." The article hailed Sophie as a rising star in healthcare, a woman with vision and charisma, who had built a patient-first model with the backing of a major corporate sponsor. Claire's pulse quickened as she read the claims. The piece praised Sophie's innovative leadership, her business acumen, and her ability to modernize patient care. But Claire knew her sister had never treated a single patient in her life, never filled out a single insurance form, never endured the endless nights of learning the craft. She flipped through the pages in disbelief until one detail stopped her cold. Sophie had secured funding by presenting herself as the founder of an earlier clinic complete with fabricated credentials and carefully polished reports. The loan applications and proposals bore data stolen from Claire's practice, twisted to look as though Sophie had been the one who created the foundation. The realization burned through Claire like fire. Evelyn's betrayal and the stolen files suddenly made sense. Sophie had used that information to convince a major healthcare conglomerate to invest millions in her. Within weeks, Whitman Wellness signs appeared across the city. Grand openings were covered on local television, complete with ribbon-cutting ceremonies and speeches that echoed the phrases Claire had once written in her own brochures. Reporters hung on Sophie's every word as she described her lifelong passion for helping others and her family's legacy of healing. Cameras flashed, audiences applauded, and investors poured in more money. Sophie's charm, combined with stolen data, had created the perfect illusion. The effect on Claire's modest practice was swift and brutal. Patients who had trickled into her small office began to cancel, drawn instead to the gleaming new facilities with their sleek advertisements and corporate endorsements. Some left apologetically assuring her they had appreciated her care but could not resist the allure of better resources at Whitman Wellness. Others simply vanished from her schedule, their absence leaving gaps that stretched like wounds across her calendar. Claire watched her daily patient list shrink until some afternoons she sat alone for hours, her hands idle, her thoughts dark. It was not just patients. Supplies she had once ordered with relative ease now took longer, her credit strained by the sudden decline in revenue. She overheard colleagues in the field praising Sophie's meteoric rise, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the deceit that fueled it. The local press, hungry for a success story, hailed Sophie as proof that family names and ambition could create dynasties in healthcare. Each headline drove the knife deeper, each broadcast felt like salt in a wound. Claire's efforts in her one-room clinic, quiet and earnest, were invisible next to her sister's shining empire. She tried to remind herself of Helen's words that family was who stood by you, not who shared your blood. She looked at Laura and the few staff who still checked in on her, and she tried to draw strength from their loyalty. But when she drove past the glowing sign of a new Whitman Wellness facility, its parking lot full, while her own remained nearly empty, the weight of it threatened to break her resolve. She could feel her father's hand in this too. Harold had always believed Sophie's charm would win out over Claire's discipline, and now the city seemed to prove him right. Yet, as she sat in her small office one evening, staring at the fading flower pot in the window, Claire felt something deeper than despair. She felt anger sharpen into resolve. Sophie might have stolen her data, fabricated her story, and bathed in the applause of strangers, but she had not lived the years of sacrifice that Claire had. She had not known what it meant to give up everything, to sleep on treatment tables, to keep going when the world turned its back. Those experiences could not be faked or funded. Claire clenched her hands into fists and whispered into the quiet, "You can take their eyes, Sophie, but you will not take their trust." The city might see Sophie as the golden image of success, but Claire knew the truth. And she knew that truth once revealed had the power to shatter even the brightest illusion. The rise of Whitman Wellness had already drained Claire's modest practice of its fragile momentum. Each day she watched cars bypass her small office on their way to the gleaming new facilities her sister had opened, and though she told herself trust mattered more than appearances, the numbers on her ledger told a harsher truth. Still, she fought on, determined to hold fast to the patients who remained. That determination lasted until one evening when Laura rushed into the office, pale and breathless, clutching her phone. "You need to see this," she whispered. Claire took the phone, pressed play, and felt her heart drop. The video was short, grainy, in a way that suggested secrecy, and devastating. It showed her face, her voice, her movements, grabbing a frail, elderly man by the arm and shoving him onto a treatment table. The man cried out, the camera angle catching his fear. Then came a cut to Claire, snarling words she would never say, ordering him to stop whining and threatening to end his care. The video ended abruptly, leaving a silence more damning than any closing argument. Claire's first reaction was denial. It had to be a mistake, a cruel trick. But Laura's expression told her the damage was real. "It's everywhere," Laura said softly. "Every platform, every news feed. People believe it." Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by headlines that screamed of abuse and betrayal. Comment sections filled with outrage. How could she, monster, take her license? Strangers who had never met her wrote as though they had witnessed the scene themselves. By the next morning, the phone lines at the clinic rang with cancellations. Patients who had stood by her through the smear campaign now backed away, fearful and angry. Some demanded their records immediately, unwilling to risk another appointment. Others left voicemails thick with disappointment, their trust shattered by what they thought they had seen. The waiting room, once merely quiet, now sat completely empty. The flower pot in the window withered from neglect, an echo of the life draining from the practice itself. Claire tried to fight back. She replayed the video again and again, searching for flaws. At first glance it was flawless, her face rendered with uncanny accuracy, her voice nearly indistinguishable from her own. But there was something hollow in the expressions, something slightly off in the timing. She realized with horror what she was looking at. It was not footage at all. It was a fabrication built with the tools of artificial intelligence, crafted to frame her in the most unforgivable way possible. Only someone who knew her intimately could have orchestrated it so precisely, and Claire knew without question who had. Sophie had gone beyond stealing data and fabricating records. She had built a lie so powerful it rewrote reality itself. The damage, however, was done. Investors who had still considered supporting Claire withdrew completely. Even a local charity that had once partnered with her for pro bono work announced a suspension of ties citing ethical concerns. Her income plummeted to almost nothing, her bank account draining, until even the modest rent on her one-room office became a question mark. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and wondering how much longer she could hold on. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the AI-generated version of herself, cruel and violent, a shadow that threatened to consume the real woman beneath. The sense of betrayal reached deeper than anger. It hollowed her out, leaving her wondering if rebuilding was even possible. Patients who had trusted her hands now flinched at her name. Colleagues avoided her at conferences. Even old friends hesitated to answer calls. It was as though the world had conspired to erase the truth of her life and replace it with a grotesque counterfeit. Claire's entire career, her years of sacrifice, her sleepless nights, her victories, hard-won, reduced to a lie repeated too many times to ignore. One afternoon, after yet another no-show appointment, Claire sat alone in her office staring at the empty treatment table. Dust motes floated in the shaft of light from the window. She placed her hand on the vinyl surface and felt tears prick her eyes. This table had been her bed once, years ago, when she was too poor to afford rent and too determined to give up. It had carried her through exhaustion and hunger, through doubt and dismissal. And now it sat unused, as though mocking her efforts. She whispered into the silence, "Am I finished?" The question hung in the air without answer. Claire felt as though she had reached the bottom of a well, her voice swallowed by darkness. For the first time, she could not imagine a way forward. She had survived the smear campaign, endured betrayal from within her staff, rebuilt in a single room against all odds. But this weaponized lie that stripped her of dignity and trust felt insurmountable. The city believed Sophie's story. The world believed the video. And Claire, for all her resilience, was left nearly broken, her practice hanging by a thread, and her spirit closer to defeat than ever before. The days after the video surfaced were some of the darkest Claire had ever endured. The clinic sat empty, her phone went silent except for cancellations, and she carried the crushing weight of being branded a fraud and an abuser. Each time she replayed the video, searching for flaws that might expose its falseness, she saw only her own face staring back at her, distorted into cruelty. Hope seemed further away than ever until one quiet afternoon, when a familiar knock came at the door. It was Mr. Callahan, a retired teacher in his late 70s, who had been one of her earliest patients. He carried himself slowly with a cane, his sharp eyes glinting with the persistence of someone who had lived through many storms. Claire had assumed he too would abandon her after seeing the video, but instead he lowered himself into a chair and shook his head with a wry smile. "They think they're clever," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But liars always leave fingerprints." He leaned forward, resting his cane against the desk. "That shirt you're wearing in the video, the blue one with the stitched white collar, I bought my son the same model back when he was in college. That was almost 10 years ago, and they stopped making that line after the recall. No way you'd have it now, not unless you can time travel." Claire stared at him, her pulse quickening. It was such a small detail, one she had overlooked in her endless replaying of the video, but he was right. She had never owned that shirt, and even if she had, it was from a decade past. It was the first tangible proof that the video was not just a trick of perception, but a deliberate fabrication. Encouraged by this spark of hope, Claire called Michael Torres, the attorney who had represented her in earlier disputes. Michael was a man known for his tenacity, a lawyer who never shied away from digging into details others ignored. She explained what Mr. Callahan had noticed, and within hours, Michael had a team of digital forensic experts combing through the video. They dissected every frame, every pixel, searching for anomalies invisible to the casual eye. Claire sat in on the review sessions, her stomach twisting as technicians pointed out inconsistencies. shadows that did not align with light sources, micro-expressions that lagged half a second behind the voice, metadata revealing the file had been generated on a machine using artificial intelligence software. Piece by piece, the illusion unraveled. Michael's team prepared a report that was meticulous and devastating. They showed how the likeness of Claire had been grafted onto a fabricated scene, how the audio had been stitched together from snippets of her real voice found in interviews and presentations, and how the entire video bore the signature hallmarks of AI-generated forgery. It was not only false, it was maliciously designed to ruin her. Michael leaned back after the presentation, his eyes narrowing with determination. "This isn't just defamation, Claire. This is calculated destruction. And now we can prove it." News of the findings spread cautiously at first. Michael arranged for the forensic experts to present their evidence to a local investigative journalist known for exposing frauds. Within days, an article appeared not in the sensational headlines that had condemned Claire, but in a respected column that laid out the truth step by step. It explained how deepfake technology worked, how the shirt in the video was a decade out of production, how the shadows and timing betrayed the forgery. Readers were shown side-by-side comparisons, the flaws impossible to ignore once highlighted. The public reaction shifted slowly but palpably. Some who had rushed to condemn her now expressed doubt. Patients who had canceled began calling back their voices, tentative but hopeful. "We knew it didn't seem like you once said," another whispered through tears. "I should have trusted you, Claire." The waiting room did not fill overnight, but the empty silence began to break. A trickle of patients returned enough to remind Claire that trust once fractured could still be rebuilt. For the first time in weeks, Claire allowed herself to breathe. The smear that had nearly destroyed her career was unraveling under the weight of truth. She knew Sophie would not back down easily, that there would be another move, another attack. But she also knew she was not defenseless anymore. She had allies in unexpected places, an elderly patient with a sharp memory, a lawyer with relentless focus, a team of experts who refused to let lies stand as fact. One evening, as she closed the office after treating her first full day of patients since the scandal broke, Claire paused at the door. The air was crisp, the sky painted in fading shades of orange, and she felt something she had not felt in months. It was not complete victory, nor was it safety. It was the flicker of truth, fragile but real, lighting the path ahead. She whispered to herself, "They almost erased me. Almost, but not quite." And with that, she stepped forward, ready for the battles yet to come, her spirit no longer crushed, but reignited by the power of proof. The relief Claire felt after the deepfake video was exposed as a fraud did not last long. Though patients slowly trickled back and some of her dignity had been restored, she had underestimated the depth of her parents' ambition. Harold and Marjorie had not disappeared into silence after Sophie's empire began to grow. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike again. That moment came in the form of a thick envelope hand-delivered by a courier one bleak morning. Claire tore it open with trembling hands and scanned the papers inside. Her blood ran cold as she read the bold heading, "Complaint for Division of Assets." Her parents were suing her. The lawsuit alleged that Harold and Marjorie were entitled to 50% of her clinic, both the property and the revenue it generated. The language in the filing was clinical, stripped of affection or family ties, but its intent was brutal. They claimed her practice was a family business built with their support and resources, and therefore half of its assets rightfully belonged to them. Claire sank into her chair, the weight of the betrayal pressing down like a physical force. For years they had dismissed her work, diminished her sacrifices, and now after all their sabotage, they were demanding ownership. The heart of their case rested on Harold's earlier secret. Included in the filing was a copy of the loan agreement from years ago, the very document Claire had only learned about during that Thanksgiving ambush. There, in neat ink, was Harold Whitman's signature as guarantor. The lawsuit framed it not as a reluctant favor, but as foundational proof that the clinic had only been possible through his financial risk. Without his backing, they claimed no bank would have granted her the loan, no doors would have opened, and her career would have been nothing more than a dream. To the court, it might look like indisputable evidence. Marjorie added her own twist to the claim. In sworn statements, she testified that the family had provided emotional and financial support throughout Claire's journey, painting a picture of loving parents who had stood behind their daughter every step of the way. She spoke of contributions in kind, like meals, lodging, and childcare, none of which had ever existed, but on paper, they lent a false narrative of parental involvement. Marjorie had always been skilled at weaving stories that cast her in a flattering light, and now she was using that talent in a courtroom instead of a dining room. Claire sat with Michael Torres, her attorney, as he read through the papers. His brow furrowed deeper with each page. "They've built this carefully," he said. "Your father's guarantor signature is their strongest weapon. To a judge unfamiliar with your history, it could appear as though the clinic was a family venture from the start. They're not just asking for money, Claire. They're asking to rewrite the very foundation of what you built." The realization struck like a hammer. She had fought to prove herself against rumors, betrayals, and lies. But this was different. This was not about whispers in the press or fabricated videos online. This was a legal battle, and legal battles left scars that could not be erased with a news article or a patient's testimony. If her parents won, she could lose half of everything: the practice, the revenue, the autonomy she had fought so hard to protect. Even if she kept the clinic, the partnership of blood they sought to impose would be a chain she could never escape. The news spread quickly, of course. Local outlets reported it as a family dispute gone bitter, splashing her name across headlines once again. Parents sue daughter for half of $10,000. Clinic One paper announced as if reducing years of pain and sacrifice to a grotesque spectacle. Some readers treated it as entertainment, debating in comment sections whether Claire owed her success to her parents' support. Strangers who knew nothing of her nights on a treatment table or her years of eating ramen dissected her life as though it were theirs to judge. Claire felt the ground shift beneath her once more. Patients hesitated again, uncertain whether to trust a practitioner embroiled in such a public scandal. A handful canceled appointments, citing discomfort with being caught in the middle of her family's fight. Her staff tried to reassure her, but even their faith could not shield her from the gnawing fear that this time she might not have a way out. Sophie had attacked her reputation. Evelyn had stolen her trust, but Harold and Marjorie were now attacking the very bones of her livelihood. One evening she sat at her desk, long after everyone else had gone home, the lawsuit spread out before her. Her father's signature seemed to glow on the page, a mark she had never asked for, but one that now threatened to undo her. She clenched her fists and closed her eyes, hearing again Helen Graves's words. "Family is who shows up when everything falls apart." Harold and Marjorie had shown up, yes, but only to tear her down further. The path ahead looked brutal. Courtrooms were unforgiving places where emotion carried little weight and paper carried everything. Claire knew she was heading into a fight that would demand more than resilience. It would demand proof strategy and a strength she wasn't sure she still possessed. Yet as she gathered the papers into a folder, she whispered a promise to herself. They might have drawn first blood, but she would not surrender her life's work so easily. If her parents wanted a battle in the courts, then she would meet them there, even if it meant facing the darkest chapter of her life head-on. Michael Torres had been Claire's steady anchor since the lawsuit began, poring over every line of the complaint, every record her parents had submitted to the court. Where Claire saw only betrayal and an iron wall of signatures, Michael saw cracks. He spent nights combing through the loan history, tracing transactions, and requesting files from the bank archives. One evening, he called Claire to his office, his voice urgent in a way she had never heard before. When she arrived, he was standing over his desk, papers spread in careful rows, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and controlled fury. "Claire," he said, sliding a document toward her. "Your father may have signed as guarantor, but that's not the full story. Look here." She leaned over, scanning the bank statements. The initial loan had indeed been approved with Harold's signature as guarantor, but what followed was far more damning. Within weeks of the loan's dispersal, large portions of the money were withdrawn and transferred into a secondary account under Harold's control. From there, records showed the funds moving again to Sophie. The pattern was unmistakable. Designer clothing stores, luxury vacations, a new car, all charged to accounts fueled by money borrowed in Claire's name. Claire's chest tightened as she read, her eyes burning with disbelief. While she had been scraping by on ramen noodles and falling asleep on treatment tables, the funds meant to secure her professional future had been siphoned away to finance Sophie's indulgences. The unfairness of it struck her like a physical blow. She had built her clinic on debt sacrifice and relentless labor, all while unknowingly carrying the burden of her sister's spending spree. Michael's voice was calm but resolute. "This isn't just mismanagement. It's fraud. Your father used your name and your loan to funnel money elsewhere, and your sister benefited. If they want to argue family ownership, this is what they're bringing into court, and it won't hold." He gathered the files into a neat stack and placed them in a binder. "We're filing this as evidence. Let the judge see where the money really went." The first hearing after the discovery was tense. Harold entered the courtroom with the confidence of a man certain of victory, Marjorie at his side in pearls, and a carefully rehearsed look of maternal injury. Sophie sat behind them, her expression smug. Claire kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, refusing to be drawn into their silent taunts. Michael spoke with steady authority as he presented the evidence to the judge. He laid out the trail of funds with precision, showing each transaction, each indulgent purchase, each transfer that painted a picture of deception. The courtroom shifted as the details unfolded. Harold's earlier narrative of sacrifice and risk began to unravel under the weight of numbers and receipts. Marjorie's claims of support now seemed hollow, her rehearsed sighs of disappointment drowned by the stark evidence of luxury vacations paid with money Claire never saw. The judge's expression hardened as Michael concluded, "My client did not benefit from her father's guarantee. On the contrary, she was burdened by debt, while the funds intended for her practice were misappropriated. If this case is about fairness, then fairness demands we recognize that Harold Whitman's involvement was not an act of support, but a breach of trust." Claire's heart pounded as she watched her father's face. Harold's usual mask of control faltered, his jaw tightening as he shifted in his seat. For once, he did not have a quick retort. No booming voice to dominate the room. Sophie's smugness dimmed her eyes, darting between the judge and the damning paperwork. Marjorie reached for Harold's arm, her facade of calm slipping into panic. The tide in the courtroom had shifted, and they all knew it. Reporters seated in the back began scribbling furiously, sensing the drama of reversal. The same outlets that had delighted in Claire's humiliation now had a new headline forming before their eyes: the parents who sued their daughter exposed for funneling her loan into their favored child's extravagance. The whispers that followed Claire outside the courthouse that day were different from the ones she had endured weeks earlier. Some were skeptical, some still cruel, but others carried a note of recognition, even admiration. The story was no longer one-sided. That night, Claire sat with Michael in his office, the binder of evidence between them. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself a faint smile. She was not victorious yet. The battle was far from over. But she no longer felt cornered. She had proof. She had truth. And with Michael's discovery, she had turned the lawsuit from a weapon against her into a weapon in her own defense. She looked at him and said quietly, "They've been rewriting my story for years. It feels good to finally show the real version." Michael nodded, his eyes steady. "This isn't just about defending yourself anymore, Claire. This is about holding them accountable for everything they tried to take from you." And with that, she knew the next phase of the battle had begun, not just to survive, but to reclaim the life her family had stolen piece by piece. The courthouse victory had shifted the momentum, but Claire knew she could not rely on legal battles alone to restore what had been lost. Her reputation had been battered for months, and though Michael's discovery had exposed her father's deceit, public trust required more than courtroom victories. It needed proof that her heart had never changed, that her mission was still rooted in healing rather than in profit or family feuds. That thought came to her late one evening as she walked through a downtown street lined with shelters and temporary tents. She saw the hunched figures of men and women whose lives had been stripped down to what they could carry. She thought of the empty hours in her appointment book, the treatment skills she still possessed, and the aching need for dignity in those who had none. That was when the idea struck her: a night of healing free of charge for those who had nowhere else to go. Planning the event became a mission that lifted her from the suffocating weight of the lawsuit. She called on her staff, those who had remained loyal, and asked if they would join her for one night of volunteer service. Without hesitation, they agreed. Laura arranged supplies, Anna contacted shelters, and Mark reached out to local food pantries to coordinate meals for participants. Word spread quietly, at first whispered through networks of social workers and shelter directors. Then, on a cold Friday evening, Claire opened the doors of a borrowed community center and welcomed the first line of patients. The room was simple folding chairs lined against the walls, tables with makeshift curtains for privacy, and a row of mats laid out for stretches and physical therapy exercises. Claire moved from one person to the next, her hands steady, her voice warm. She adjusted the posture of a man who had carried heavy loads for too many years, gently massaged the scar tissue of a woman who had been injured on the streets, and guided a teenager through breathing exercises for anxiety. Each interaction reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place. Healing was not about clinics or profits, not about glossy signs or family dynasties. It was about human connection. Reporters came tipped off by community leaders who recognized the rarity of such an event. Cameras rolled, but this time Claire did not feel cornered or scrutinized. She felt purposeful. The coverage the next morning told a very different story than the headlines that had haunted her for months. Local news ran segments showing her kneeling beside patients, her hands steady on their shoulders, her face filled with compassion. The headline read, "Dr. Claire Whitman brings healing to the streets." For once, the press did not describe her as embattled or disgraced. They described her as what she had always been: a healer. The ripple effect was immediate. Donations began arriving through the community center's website, many accompanied by notes of encouragement. "I knew the video was fake. Thank you for proving me right. You cared for my mother years ago, and now you're caring for those who have no one. You deserve support." Even small checks carried weight, each one a reminder that people believed in her again. Inspired by the response, Laura suggested setting up a formal fundraising campaign with the specific goal of reclaiming the old clinic building that had once been Claire's pride. At first, Claire hesitated, wary of appearing desperate. But when patients themselves began asking if she planned to reopen the larger space, she realized it was not about appearances. It was about reclaiming her ability to serve. The campaign launched with a simple message: healing belongs to everyone. Claire appeared in a short video filmed not in a studio, but in the one-room clinic she still operated, speaking plainly into the camera. She told her story not as a victim, but as a survivor. She described the importance of accessible care, the need for dignity, and the promise of rebuilding. Donations surged. Former patients contributed, strangers sent in small amounts, and even colleagues who had once doubted her sent messages of support. The total grew week by week until one afternoon Laura burst into Claire's office with tears in her eyes. They had reached their goal. The old clinic could be leased once more. Standing before the building a few days later, Claire ran her fingers along the faded lettering still etched into the glass doors. The space bore the scars of its closure, the dust of abandonment, but she saw only potential. This was where her dream had first taken shape, where patients had once filled the waiting room, and where laughter had echoed in staff meetings. Now, thanks to a night of healing that reminded the city of who she truly was, she had a chance to breathe life into it again. As she unlocked the doors with new keys, Claire felt something she had not felt since before the first ambush at Thanksgiving. It was not just hope. It was strength born of scars, a certainty that even as her family tried to strip her of everything the community she had served would always stand ready to lift her back up. The success of the Night of Healing gave Claire more than community goodwill. It gave her the clarity to strike back where it mattered most. For months, Sophie had basked in the glow of corporate funding and media adoration, her empire built on stolen data and fabricated credentials. Claire had held her tongue, focusing instead on survival. But with her reputation slowly recovering and her old clinic nearly within reach, she knew the time had come to confront the lies at the heart of Sophie's empire. Michael Torres had already gathered the documents during his investigation of Harold's misuse of funds. Among the records were copies of proposals Sophie had submitted to the healthcare conglomerate backing Whitman Wellness. At first glance, they seemed legitimate, polished reports full of charts, patient outcomes, and business strategies. But Michael had highlighted section after section that mirrored Claire's own original clinic data. Treatment protocols she had written word for word, outcome metrics pulled directly from her files, even photographs of patient areas lifted from her brochures. It was not inspiration. It was theft. Claire sat at her desk late into the night, assembling a dossier with every piece of evidence Michael had uncovered. She added her own records to show the original's dates that predated Sophie's proposals by years. The parallels were undeniable. Sophie had not only lied about her credentials, she had presented Claire's work as her own foundation for corporate investment. When the packet was complete, Claire addressed it to the board of the conglomerate and included a brief letter. Her words were measured professional but cut like glass. The truth, she wrote, is not as marketable as Sophie's charm, but it is documented here. I trust your organization values integrity as much as it values profit. 2 weeks later, news broke. The conglomerate announced it was suspending all funding to Whitman Wellness pending an internal review. The press release was carefully worded, citing concerns regarding documentation inconsistencies, but the meaning was clear. Sophie's lifeline had been severed. The media that had once hailed her as a visionary now turned their attention to the scandal, questioning whether her rapid rise had been built on fraud. Claire read the headlines with a quiet, steady satisfaction. Behind the scenes, regulators took notice as well. Michael forwarded her reports to state investigators who launched an inquiry into Sophie's conduct. Subpoenas followed demanding records from Whitman Wellness. Former employees began to speak anonymously to reporters, describing a leader who relied on charisma rather than competence, who demanded results she did not understand, and who brushed off concerns about accuracy. The image Sophie had so carefully constructed began to crumble. For Claire, it was not about gloating. It was about justice. She had spent years being diminished, accused, and nearly erased while her sister stole her work and wore it like a crown. Now the truth was surfacing not in whispers or accusations, but in the undeniable language of evidence. Patients who had once left her for the allure of Whitman Wellness began to call again, their voices tinged with regret. "We should never have doubted you," one said softly over the phone. Another admitted, "It all makes sense now. I want to come back." Sophie, meanwhile, found herself cornered. Without corporate money, her clinics faltered. Bills mounted, staff resigned, and reporters hounded her at every appearance. The board of the conglomerate released a harsher statement weeks later, announcing a full termination of their partnership and referring the matter to legal authorities. Sophie was no longer the golden child of healthcare innovation. She was the subject of an investigation. Claire watched it unfold from the quiet of her modest office. There was no celebration, no vindictive outburst. She simply felt a deep, steady calm, as though the scales had finally tipped back toward balance. For so long, Sophie had thrived by manipulating perception, by dazzling others into ignoring reality. But perception had limits, and reality, once revealed, was stronger. That evening, Claire stood in the old clinic she was preparing to reopen, the keys cool in her hand. The walls still needed paint, the equipment still needed to be moved in, but for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her family's shadow lifting. She whispered to herself, "One truth at a time." And with Sophie exposed, the path ahead looked clearer than it had in a very long time. The downfall of Sophie's corporate empire gave Claire some peace of mind, but the lawsuit filed by Harold and Marjorie remained unresolved, hanging over her like a storm cloud that refused to move. The day of the final hearing arrived and the courtroom was filled to capacity. Reporters lined the back, eager for another headline in the saga of the Whitman family. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table beside Michael Torres, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her pulse steady but quick. She had been through too much to falter now, but she knew everything could be decided in the next few hours. Judge Foster, a man with graying hair and a reputation for pragmatism, took his seat with the kind of weariness that comes from decades on the bench. From the start, his questions suggested skepticism toward Claire's defense. He examined Harold's guarantor signature with pointed interest, remarking on the seriousness of such a commitment. "A father places his name against a loan," Foster said, "and that is no small act. Without it, the bank would have walked away. One could argue the foundation of this clinic rests on his risk." Claire felt the weight of the judge's words settle heavily over the room. Marjorie dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her performance as the supportive mother perfectly rehearsed. Harold sat rigid, his chin lifted as though victory was already his. Michael presented the evidence of financial misappropriation, the transfers from Claire's loan account into Sophie's spending sprees. But Harold's attorney countered, arguing the transactions were irrelevant, that the guarantee still bound Claire to acknowledge her father's role. For a tense half hour, the momentum tilted against her. Judge Foster's remarks grew sharper, his questions cutting into Michael's arguments with a tone that suggested doubt. Claire stared at the grain of the wooden table before her, reminding herself to breathe, to wait, to trust. Then Michael stood, his expression composed, but his voice carrying a quiet edge of triumph. "Your Honor," he said before you rule, "there is one final piece of evidence the defense would like to submit." He placed a small device on the table, pressed a button, and the room filled with voices. At first muffled, then clear as day. It was Sophie's voice, unmistakable, dripping with arrogance. "Evelyn, once the clinic collapses, under Claire will step in. With Dad's signature and Mom's testimony, she won't stand a chance. You'll handle the inside, I'll handle the outside. Claire won't even see it coming." Evelyn's voice followed, eager and complicit. "She trusts me too much. By the time she realizes, it'll be too late. We'll make the clinic ours." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Claire felt her breath catch the words echoing like knives finally pulled from wounds. The jury, the reporters, even the judge sat frozen as the recording played on, leaving no doubt about the conspiracy that had been hatched against her. When the audio ended, Michael let the silence linger before speaking again. "This is not the story of a father's sacrifice or a mother's support. This is the story of a family attempting to steal from their own daughter to twist her life's work into their own. The guarantee was never about risk. It was about leverage." Judge Foster removed his glasses, rubbing his temple, slowly, visibly shaken. When he spoke again, his tone was no longer skeptical. "Mr. Whitman. Mrs. Whitman, this court cannot overlook what we have just heard. Your credibility is compromised beyond repair. What you presented as support now appears as a calculated scheme. This court rules in favor of the defendant, Dr. Claire Whitman. The claim for 50% ownership is dismissed with prejudice." The words reverberated through the courtroom like a gavel strike, louder than any sound could carry. Harold's face turned a deep red, his composure cracking as he leaned back in his chair, muttering under his breath. Marjorie dropped her tissue. Her performance shattered her expression, twisting into disbelief. Sophie sat in the gallery, her eyes wide, the mask of control slipping entirely as reporters turned their cameras toward her. Evelyn's absence only underscored her guilt, her name now forever tied to betrayal. Claire sat motionless for a moment, the weight of the ruling washing over her in waves. For so long she had braced for loss, for the familiar sting of dismissal. But now at last the law had spoken in her favor. Michael placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his voice low so only she could hear. "It's over, Claire. You've won." As she rose from the table, the room erupted into noise, reporters shouting questions, attorneys gathering papers, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Claire walked past her parents without a glance, her steps firm, her heart steadier than it had been in years. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the chains of their control snap. She was free, not just in the eyes of the court, but in her own. The ruling in Claire's favor echoed beyond the walls of the courtroom, spilling into every corner of the community. Newspapers printed headlines about the Whitman family's betrayal. Television anchors replayed clips of the audio that exposed Sophie and Evelyn's conspiracy. And for the first time, the public saw Claire not as a figure of scandal, but as a woman who had fought her own family's treachery with dignity and truth. The spotlight that once condemned her now turned its glare on Harold, Marjorie, and Sophie, and under that harsh light, their carefully constructed images began to collapse. Sophie was the first to fall. The corporate investigation into Whitman Wellness accelerated after the courtroom revelation, and regulators uncovered not only the stolen data, but also a series of falsified reports she had submitted to secure ongoing funding. The conglomerate publicly severed ties with her, calling the entire enterprise unsustainable due to gross misrepresentation. Her name, once synonymous with innovation, became shorthand for deceit. Reporters who had once praised her now referred to her as the fraud in pearls, mocking her lavish public appearances. Within weeks, her clinic's shuttered employees abandoned her, and her social media accounts became battlegrounds of ridicule and anger. Invitations to charity. Galas disappeared, her phone calls went unanswered, and her once gilded reputation disintegrated into silence. Marjorie fared no better, though her collapse came in private rather than in headlines. Accustomed to being admired as the graceful matriarch, she was unprepared for the cold stares and whispers that now followed her in the grocery store at church, and in the very clubs where she once reigned supreme. Friends who had once fawned over her began avoiding her, unwilling to be associated with the family's disgrace. The stress gnawed at her relentlessly, until one night she collapsed in her kitchen. The ambulance carried her to the hospital, where she was admitted for exhaustion and anxiety. News of her hospitalization leaked, and the press framed it as the tragic unraveling of a woman who had tried to mask cruelty with charm. Claire received the calls from the hospital, but declined to visit. Her compassion as a healer warred with her scars as a daughter, and for once, she allowed herself to choose distance over duty. Harold's downfall struck hardest of all. The man who had spent his life cultivating power in the community found that power dissolving overnight. Business associates who had once sought his handshake now avoided his gaze. His name, once a ticket to exclusive clubs and lucrative deals, became toxic. Even his old golfing partners stopped inviting him, wary of being photographed beside a man now infamous for betraying his own child. The most cutting blow came from the church elders he had long counted as allies. They issued a public statement condemning his actions, emphasizing that the community would not stand with a man who exploited family for personal gain. For Harold, who thrived on respect, the ostracism was more devastating than any financial loss. Claire watched it all unfold from a distance. Reporters clamored for interviews, eager to capture her reaction to her family's ruin. They wanted the soundbite of triumph, the declaration of revenge fulfilled. But each time the calls came, she politely declined. She told one journalist in a brief email, "This is not my story to tell anymore. My focus is on healing, not on their downfall." Her refusal to speak only deepened public fascination, casting her as the dignified survivor who would not lower herself to pettiness. In private, though, Claire wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of her felt vindicated, knowing the truth had finally been laid bare. Another part felt hollow, grieving not for the family she had, but for the one she had always wished for, and never received. When she drove past the shuttered doors of Whitman Wellness, or saw Harold's empty seat at the club where he once held court, she did not feel joy. She felt the inevitability of consequences, the quiet recognition that lies always catch up to those who weave them too tightly. Her staff noticed the change in her demeanor. She smiled more often now, not out of triumph, but out of relief. Patients returned in greater numbers, drawn not only by her skill, but by the story of resilience that now defined her. She poured herself into her work, choosing to build rather than dwell. Each canceled interview, each unanswered reporter's question, was her way of setting boundaries that had been denied her for so long. She had been forced into battles she never wanted, but she would not let them define the rest of her life. The Whitman family name, once polished and respected, was now spoken with a mixture of pity and disdain. Sophie hid from cameras, Marjorie remained in treatment, and Harold walked the streets with the air of a man stripped of his crown. Claire, by contrast, rose from the wreckage with her dignity intact. She understood that justice had not come from vengeance alone, but from truth revealed, and she chose to let that truth stand, without her commentary. For the first time in years, her life was not about surviving her family's betrayals. It was about living on her own terms, even as the family that had sought to destroy her crumbled under the weight of their own deceit. In the weeks that followed the collapse of her family's public image, Claire felt the air around her finally begin to clear. The name Whitman no longer brought whispers of scandal directed at her, but murmurs of disgrace tied to Harold and Sophie. Patients returned steadily, the old clinic filled again with life, and her staff worked with renewed purpose. Yet Claire knew rebuilding her practice was only part of her journey. What mattered most was ensuring that no young student with dreams of healing would have to endure the kind of isolation and hardship she had faced. It was that conviction that led her to conceive the idea of a scholarship. She announced it during a small but carefully organized event at the clinic, inviting local press community leaders and a handful of former patients whose stories embodied resilience. The waiting room had been transformed into a modest stage, the walls decorated with photographs of patients and staff together, not glossy advertisements, but genuine moments of care. Claire stood at the podium, her hands steady on the sides, her voice calm yet filled with emotion. "When I was a student," she began, "I worked nights in a cafeteria and lived in a one-room apartment without a proper bed. I studied while exhausted, and I built this dream while eating ramen noodles. I know what it means to fight for education while every door seems closed, and I know how easily a single helping hand can change everything." The audience leaned in the weight of her words settling like a collective memory. Claire paused, her eyes moving across the room, taking in the faces of those who had walked their own hard paths. "That's why today," she continued, "I am proud to announce the Healing Hands Scholarship. Each year it will provide financial support for medical and physical therapy students who show not only academic promise, but resilience. This scholarship is for those who have faced obstacles yet refuse to quit, for those who carry not only knowledge in their minds, but compassion in their hearts." Applause broke out, warm and genuine, but Claire was not finished. She spoke of her journey not as a tale of triumph over enemies, but as a testament to the strength of perseverance. She shared the nights she had slept on treatment tables, the mornings she had questioned whether she could continue, and the countless times she had been dismissed as invisible. She admitted the betrayals had nearly broken her, but each scar had taught her the value of building something larger than herself. "I do not want the next generation to build alone," she said, her voice catching for the first time. "I want them to know that someone believes in them, even when the world tells them they are not enough." The room erupted with applause again, some rising to their feet. The local press captured the moment, not with the harsh headlines that once shadowed her, but with praise. From scandal to scholarship, one article read the next morning. Others highlighted her courage to turn personal pain into collective hope. Donations poured in almost immediately from patients, alumni of her practice, and even strangers who had followed her story. Within a month, the scholarship fund exceeded expectations, enough to guarantee several awards for the first year. The response overwhelmed Claire not because of the money, but because of what it represented. Each contribution was a vote of confidence, a declaration that her community saw her not as the product of betrayal, but as the embodiment of resilience. Former patients sent letters describing how they had been inspired by her decision. One young woman wrote, "I dropped out of my program because I couldn't afford it. Your story makes me believe I can try again." Another student sent an email late at night admitting, "I've been working double shifts at a diner just like you did. Knowing someone like you has walked this path gives me hope I might make it too." Claire read every message often with tears in her eyes. She saw herself in those students, not just their struggles, but their determination. She knew the scholarship was more than a financial gift. It was a promise, a hand extended in the darkness she had once walked through alone. It was her way of breaking the cycle her family had trapped her in, of proving that success was not about hoarding, but about giving. As she left the clinic that night, the echoes of applause still in her ears, Claire stood on the steps and looked up at the darkening sky. The air was crisp, the city alive around her, and for the first time she felt that her story had shifted fully from survival to purpose. She whispered to herself, "Let them crumble. I will build." And with the scholarship now born, she knew she had begun creating a legacy that would outlast every betrayal her family had ever inflicted. The announcement of the Healing Hands Scholarship had cemented Claire's place as more than just a survivor of betrayal. She was now recognized as a leader with vision and compassion. The applause from the community had hardly faded when a message arrived that made her pause. It was from her mother, polite but unmistakably pleading, asking if the family could meet her at a local coffee shop. The note promised no arguments, no drama, only a chance to talk like family again. Claire hesitated. She had endured years of manipulation, months of legal warfare, and a lifetime of being overshadowed. But part of her knew she needed to face them one final time, not to reconcile on their terms, but to set the boundaries that would define her future. The coffee shop was warm and filled with the smell of roasted beans when she walked in. At a corner table sat Harold, Marjorie, and Sophie, dressed in neutral tones, as though they had coordinated to appear harmless. On the table sat a small paper bag from her mother's favorite bakery, the faint scent of blueberry muffins rising from it. Marjorie smiled too brightly as Claire approached. "We brought your favorite," she said, pushing the bag toward her. Claire sat, leaving the bag untouched, her eyes steady on theirs. For a moment the conversation was tentative. Marjorie asked about the clinic as if nothing had happened. Harold commented on the weather. Sophie fidgeted with her phone. It was a performance, a desperate attempt to rewrite the years of betrayal with polite small talk. Claire let them speak until the silence grew awkward. Then she leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "If you called me here to pretend you've wasted your time, I'm here to make one thing clear. If there's to be any kind of relationship between us, it will be on my terms." The air shifted, their polite masks faltering. Sophie set her phone down. Marjorie dabbed her eyes, though no tears had yet fallen, and Harold's jaw tightened. Claire took a breath and spoke each word with precision, as if carving them into stone. "There are 3 conditions. First, none of you will ever manage or attempt to control my clinic. It is mine, built by my hands and my sacrifices, and you have no place in its leadership. Second, you will not interfere in my professional decisions, whether directly or through whispers in the community. I will not tolerate sabotage dressed as advice. Third, you will not use my name or the name of my practice to elevate yourselves. My reputation is mine. My work is mine. You will not claim it." Her words landed like hammer strikes. Harold opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. For the first time, Claire could remember he was silent, his authority deflated by the certainty in her tone. Marjorie pressed the napkin to her eyes, this time with real tears forming. "Claire, we're your parents. We just want to be close again," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and desperation. Claire held her gaze unflinching. "Then respect these conditions. Without them, there is no closeness. There is no relationship." Sophie sat frozen, her face pale, the confidence she had once wielded gone. She had always believed she could charm her way out of consequences, but the look in Claire's eyes left no room for negotiation. For the first time, Sophie seemed to grasp that her sister's boundaries were immovable. The coffee shop hummed with quiet chatter around them, but at that table silence reigned. Claire waited, giving them the chance to speak, but none of them did. Harold stared at the table. Marjorie sniffled softly. Sophie twisted her hands in her lap. Claire pushed back her chair, rising to her feet. "These are not threats," she said, her voice steady. "They are the terms of any relationship with me from this day forward. If you cannot accept them, then we part ways here." She picked up her coat, leaving the untouched bag of muffins on the table, and walked toward the door. As she stepped out into the crisp air, she felt no guilt, no hesitation. She had not come to beg for peace or to reopen old wounds. She had come to draw the final line, to reclaim what had always been hers. Behind her, the family she once longed for sat, stunned, their power over her shattered. For the first time, Claire felt entirely free. The meeting at the coffee shop had left Claire lighter than she had ever felt. She had set her boundaries with a firmness her family could no longer breach, and in the days that followed, she turned her full attention to the work that mattered most. The clinic flourished. Patients returned in greater numbers, many moved by her story of resilience, and the scholarship initiative drew admiration from across the community. With her reputation restored and trust renewed, the waiting list stretched far beyond what her single location could accommodate. After long discussions with her staff, she decided it was time to expand. The second branch of Healing Hands opened on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood often overlooked by larger medical practices. The building was modest, but filled with light painted in warm colors and staffed by a team Claire had personally trained. On opening day, the line of patients wrapped around the block. She stood at the entrance, greeting each one, remembering the days when she had begged for a handful of appointments. Now she offered care not only to those who sought her, but to those who had once been forgotten. The success of the new branch exceeded even her cautious hopes, and within a year a third location followed. Each space carried the same ethos: healing with dignity, care rooted in compassion, excellence without arrogance. Word of her growth reached beyond the city. Colleagues in other states invited her to speak at conferences, eager to hear how she had built a thriving practice despite scandal and betrayal. She spoke not of revenge or victory, but of persistence, teamwork, and integrity. Her message resonated deeply, especially with younger professionals struggling under financial burdens and institutional neglect. Claire's name, once tied to controversy, now stood as a beacon of credibility and strength. The culmination of this recognition came when the State Medical Association announced she would be honored with the Award for Excellence in Patient Care. It was the highest acknowledgement they could bestow, reserved for practitioners who had not only demonstrated outstanding skill, but had also elevated the profession itself. Claire accepted the news with quiet humility, but her staff celebrated with unrestrained joy. They decorated the clinic with banners and balloons, insisting she finally allow herself to enjoy the honor. The night of the ceremony arrived, held in a grand hall filled with physicians, therapists, researchers, and leaders of the medical community. Claire walked onto the stage in a simple navy dress, her posture straight, her eyes calm. As the president of the association introduced her, recounting her journey from a one-room clinic to a network of thriving practices, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The applause washed over her, not as noise but as affirmation that every sleepless night, every cruel betrayal had led her to this moment. As she looked out into the crowd, her eyes caught a familiar sight near the back of the hall. Harold and Marjorie sat together, their once commanding presence diminished. No one flocked to shake Harold's hand, no one paused to compliment Marjorie's pearls. They were two figures in the shadows, quietly present, but forgotten by the world they had once dominated. Claire felt a pang of something, pity perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that time and truth had reduced them to what they were. They were not enemies to conquer anymore. They were remnants of a story she had already written past. When she accepted the award, her voice was steady, her words chosen carefully. She spoke of her staff, her patients, her mentors. She thanked those who had believed in her when belief was all she had to offer in return. She spoke of resilience, of the power of community, of the importance of choosing compassion over ambition. Not once did she mention her family, though she knew they were listening. The absence of their names was louder than any condemnation. After the ceremony, photographs of Claire holding the award appeared across newspapers and online journals. Commentators praised not only her achievements, but her grace, noting the dignity with which she had carried herself throughout her ordeals. At the same time, no one asked Harold or Marjorie for a comment. They had faded into irrelevant spectators at the success of the daughter they had tried to control. As the evening ended and Claire stood outside beneath the cool night sky, the award heavy in her hands, she realized she no longer carried the weight of proving herself. She had risen stronger not to spite her family, but to fulfill the promise she had always carried within her. The world saw her now, not through their distorted lens, but through her own truth. And in that moment she knew her story had moved beyond survival. It had become a triumph. The applause from the Medical Association ceremony still echoed in Claire's memory when she returned to her daily rhythm at the clinic. The award now sat in her office not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder of the journey she had walked. She felt settled, more certain of herself than ever before, yet life had one final test of her convictions waiting. The healing hands. Scholarship had drawn hundreds of applicants in its first year, each essay a story of hardship and persistence. Claire reviewed many of them personally, often moved to tears by the resilience of young students desperate to become healers. The committee, composed of staff and community leaders, handled the selection process, fairly anonymizing names, to ensure decisions were based on merit rather than reputation. When the final list of recipients was drawn up, Claire scanned it with quiet pride. Then her eyes stopped on a name that struck like a jolt: Sophie Whitman. For a long moment she stared at the page, unable to reconcile the words. Sophie, her sister, the very woman who had tried to dismantle her clinic, steal her reputation, and humiliate her, was now listed as a recipient of the very scholarship Claire had created. The essay, stripped of identifiers when first reviewed, had told the story of someone humbled by failure, searching for redemption, and seeking to enter the field of physical rehabilitation. It had been compelling enough to win over the committee without anyone realizing who the writer was. Claire sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. She could have intervened, could have pulled strings to revoke the award once she knew the truth. No one would have blamed her. Yet as she thought about the words in Sophie's essay, the tone of desperation and regret, she recognized something familiar. It was the same hunger she herself had once carried, the need for one chance, one hand reaching out in the dark. Perhaps Sophie had written it cynically. Perhaps it was another manipulation, but Claire knew she could not deny the possibility of change. To punish Sophie by denying the scholarship would be to betray the very principle on which she had built it, that everyone deserves a chance when they have nothing left. She made her decision quickly and quietly. Sophie would keep the award. The truth of its donor would remain hidden. To the world, it would appear as though the Healing Hands Scholarship Committee had simply chosen her based on merit, and Sophie would never know her sister's hand was behind it. Claire signed the approval, placed the folder back on the desk, and closed the matter in her heart. Laura Chen, her most trusted colleague, was the only one who noticed the flicker of recognition on Claire's face when the recipient list was finalized. Later, she approached Claire in private, her voice low. "You saw her name, didn't you?" Claire met her gaze and nodded. Laura's eyes softened with understanding. "You're really going to let it stand?" Claire's reply was steady. "Yes, she doesn't need to know. If she uses this chance to build a life, good. If she wastes it, that's her burden. Either way, it won't be because I denied her the opportunity." Laura said nothing more, only placed a reassuring hand on Claire's arm. Her silence an oath to keep the secret. Weeks later, the recipients were announced publicly. Sophie attended the small ceremony with an uncharacteristically subdued demeanor. She accepted the award check with a polite smile, her voice quiet when she thanked the committee. Gone was the arrogant bravado that had once filled every room she entered. Claire watched from a distance, hidden in the crowd, her heart steady. She felt no desire to approach, no need for acknowledgement. This was not about repairing their relationship or seeking gratitude. It was about living her values without compromise. As the evening ended, Claire stepped outside into the cool night air. Laura joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They stood together in silence for a moment, before Laura spoke softly. "You know this will never be in the papers. No one will ever write that the woman who was betrayed gave her betrayer a second chance." Claire smiled faintly, her breath visible in the cold air. "That's the point. Some things don't need to be known. They just need to be done." In that moment, Claire realized that forgiveness did not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it meant offering grace in silence, expecting nothing in return. Sophie would never know, and Claire was at peace with that. The world saw her as strong, resilient, triumphant, but only she knew the deeper truth. Strength was not only in victory, but in choosing mercy, when vengeance would have been easier. The night Claire watched Sophie accept the scholarship in silence stayed with her for weeks. It reminded her of the fragile line between giving and protecting, between compassion and exploitation. She had walked that line her whole life, and now for the first time she wanted to put into words what she had learned. Late evenings in her office turned into writing sessions, the glow of her desk lamp illuminating notebooks filled with memories, principles, and lessons hard-earned. Slowly, those fragments took shape into a manuscript. She titled it "Healing with Boundaries," a phrase that captured not only her philosophy as a practitioner, but her journey as a woman who had learned to guard her own worth. The book was not an autobiography in the traditional sense, though pieces of her story were woven throughout. It was a guide for young healers entering medicine with open hearts, but little protection against the weight of expectations. She wrote about the necessity of empathy balanced with self-respect, about the danger of overextending until one's own life crumbled, about the courage it took to say no when others demanded too much. She shared the mistakes she had made, not as shame, but as lessons, describing the nights she sacrificed her health for patients, the years she allowed her family to define her value, and the strength it took to draw boundaries even with those she loved. Each chapter ended with what she called a creed, short affirmations students could carry with them. "I am more than what others demand. I heal, but I also protect. My worth is not measured by sacrifice alone." When the book was published, it surprised even her how quickly it resonated. Medical schools adopted it as recommended. Reading students carried copies dog-eared and underlined, and letters began arriving from across the country. Young practitioners wrote to her about how her words gave them permission to care for themselves as fiercely as they cared for others. One wrote, "I was ready to quit my program until I read your chapter on invisibility. You made me realize I am not weak for struggling. I am human." Another confessed, "My own family tells me I'm wasting my time in this field. Your story made me feel less alone." Claire did not write the book for fame, but it opened doors she had never imagined. Invitations came to lecture at universities, to lead workshops on professional boundaries, to speak about the human side of medicine at conferences that once would have overlooked her. She accepted, carefully balancing her commitments with the work at her clinics, always reminding herself not to slip into the trap of overextension again. One of her proudest moments came when she began teaching a seminar series at the local medical school. She stood before rows of students, many no older than she had been when she first slept on treatment tables to save money, and spoke not only about anatomy and techniques, but about values. She asked them to share their own stories, to voice the pressures they carried to practice, saying aloud the boundaries they feared would make them seem selfish. In those classrooms, she felt she was building something that would last far longer than any single clinic. Her mentorship extended beyond lectures. She met individually with students who sought her guidance, listening as they spoke of impossible schedules, family doubts, and financial stress. She did not always have answers, but she offered honesty and solidarity. "You are not alone," she would tell them, "and you are not less of a healer for needing care yourself." In time, her role as mentor became as important to her as her role as practitioner. Patients still filled her days, and she still cherished the moments of progress she witnessed in their healing, but guiding the next generation gave her a sense of legacy. She had spent years fighting to prove her worth against those who sought to diminish it. Now she poured her energy into ensuring others would not have to fight as she had. At a conference where she was honored as keynote speaker, Claire looked out over an audience of hundreds of young doctors, therapists, and students, all of them clutching her book, all of them eager for guidance. She realized then that her life's story had transformed into something greater than revenge or survival. It had become a creed, a way of living, a promise passed forward. She closed her speech with words she hoped they would carry long after the night ended. Healing is not only what you give to others, it is also what you protect within yourself. Never forget both matter. As the crowd rose in applause, Claire felt a calm certainty. Her family's betrayals had nearly destroyed her, but they had also forged her into the woman standing on that stage. And by sharing her creed, she was ensuring that others would stand taller sooner with less pain than she had endured. That she realized was the truest form of healing she could ever offer. The success of Claire's book and her growing role as a mentor had given her a sense of peace she had not known for most of her life. Yet when the time came to open the newest branch of Healing Hands, she knew there was one more step she needed to take, not for them, but for herself. She drafted an invitation addressed to Harold and Marjorie. It was short, almost businesslike, letting them know the date of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. She included no words of reconciliation, no offers of closeness, simply an acknowledgement that they were her parents and could attend as guests, nothing more. For years she had carried the weight of their absence and betrayal at every milestone. This time she would not erase them, but she would not center them either. The morning of the grand opening arrived crisp and bright. The new clinic gleamed with polished glass doors and banners stretched across the entrance, welcoming patients and community members alike. Crowds gathered, including local officials, colleagues, and former patients, eager to celebrate her expansion. Claire moved among them with calm composure, thanking those who had believed in her and sharing quiet words of encouragement. When Harold and Marjorie arrived, they stood off to the side, dressed carefully but noticeably subdued. No one approached them. No one asked for their stories or their smiles. They were spectators now, not players, and the shift in power was unmistakable. Claire greeted them briefly, offering a polite nod before turning back to her staff. There was no embrace, no attempt at warmth. She had invited them as an act of her own choosing, not as a concession. They were present, but they no longer held the power to shape her life or define her success. Marjorie dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, overcome perhaps by regret, while Harold sat in rigid silence, his pride clearly stung by the reality that he was only another face in the crowd. As the ceremony unfolded, speeches were given by community leaders praising Claire's resilience and her commitment to patient care. A local representative spoke of how her clinics had revitalized underserved neighborhoods. Another praised the Healing Hands Scholarship for opening doors to students once left behind. When Claire stepped to the podium, applause rose like a wave, warm and unrelenting. She looked out at the faces before her, seeing in them the community she had chosen as her true family. Among them in the far corner, she noticed Sophie. Her sister had not approached, had not spoken, but she lingered at a distance, her expression caught between bitterness and longing. When their eyes met briefly, Sophie's lips curved into a smile that held no joy, only a trace of envy mixed with resignation. She turned away before Claire could read more. Claire continued her speech with poise. She thanked her staff, her patients, her mentors, and the community that had lifted her when she thought she might collapse. She spoke not of revenge or bitterness, but of growth. Healing, she said slowly, her voice carrying into the hushed crowd, is not about erasing wounds. It is about living with them and still choosing to move forward. We do not heal to forget. We heal to continue. The words hung in the air, resonating with everyone present, from patients who had overcome injury to students who carried invisible scars of their own. The ribbon was cut, the doors opened, and the new clinic welcomed its first patients that very afternoon. Reporters covered the event with glowing headlines, photographs of Claire smiling among her team, her parents barely visible in the background, unnoticed by most. For Harold and Marjorie, it was a humbling reminder that their daughter's story no longer needed them to exist. For Sophie, watching from afar, it was the bitter realization that her sister had achieved everything she once tried to steal, not through shortcuts or manipulation, but through persistence and integrity. As the day wound down and Claire walked through the new halls, she paused for a moment in the reception area. The space was filled with light, the sound of laughter and conversation echoing faintly. She thought of the years of struggle, the betrayals that had nearly broken her, and the strength it had taken to rise again. She whispered softly, not to anyone else, but to herself, "I heal not to forget, but to live on." And in that quiet moment, she knew her story had reached its true conclusion, not with revenge or reconciliation, but with boundaries firmly drawn and a life lived fully on her own terms. Now that Claire's journey has come full circle, from betrayal at her family's Thanksgiving table to courtroom battles to rebuilding her clinic and leaving a legacy of strength and compassion, we're left with a powerful truth. Healing isn't about forgetting the scars of the past. It's about choosing to move forward while remembering who we are and never allowing anyone to define our worth for us. Claire's story reminds us that resilience can outlast betrayal, that boundaries can coexist with compassion, and that sometimes forgiveness means offering grace without surrendering your power. But now I'd like to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Claire's shoes? Would you have drawn such firm lines with your family or chosen a different path? Do you think her silent act of helping Sophie was strength, or was it too generous after everything? Your perspective matters, and I can't wait to read your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, inspired you, or kept you hooked until the very end, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have more stories of resilience, betrayal, and redemption coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Subscribe, share your opinion, and join this community where every voice adds meaning to the journey.